Now we've established the relationships between genres, emotions, and characters' role. It's time to define our context. In order to define our context, we'll need our notion of genre, and we'll continue to apply our principle of clarity, diversity, and synergy. When it comes to clarity, the fact of having this simple system of 4 to 6 genres allow us to create more versatile context in a more diverse manner. And today we'll also start to board the notion of frame, allowing us to establish a synergy between genre and frame. Now, how do you create a context? The context is the combination of a genre with an appropriate frame. Or said differently, it's a genre framed properly. Now, in order to pick your genre, you need to determine the emotion you want to display, the emotion you want the characters to feel. This emotion will be displayed through your character. If it's displayed properly, you can hope for the public, as it is attached now to your character, will feel the same emotion, or at least an adjacent emotion. So first, choose the emotion you want to make the characters feel, subsequently the public. Then, select the attached genre, the genre which is supposed to produce this emotion, and finally, frame this genre. Now, how do you frame a genre, and what does framing mean here? Framing essentially means adjusting. Once you've selected your genre, you have to consider that your genre adds specificity in terms of characters, environment, storyline, objects, and symbols. Now, you can make use of any kind of character, any kind of environment, any kind of storyline, any kind of item and symbol in any genre. But their value, the subjective factor, the identification, will be different if proposed in a specific genre. So said differently, let's suppose your frame is war. If your framework of your story is a war story, and your genre is action, it will not have the same value as if your genre was adventure, drama, horror. Your the framework you're selecting at the end is colored by the genre you've previously selected. So, when you begin to frame your genre, consider the end of your story. As you've started to write the end of your story, consider the first chapter of your story, consider the introduction of your story, consider which character you're going to present for this story, and in which order you're going to present them, and same for the setting. So, framing is a chronological matter, essentially. Framing calls to the concept of progressiveness in your story. You've established your genre fairly early. Now you're finishing chapter 3, starting chapter 4 now. So it's fairly early in the first part of your story. You're establishing your genre. And now, from this first part, your story will continue to evolve. And so you'll have to adjust progressively the frame to the genre by continuing to present new character, new settings, new issues. through a chronological pattern which will serve the frame you've selected. Because you want the interpretation of the characters, the interpretation of the public to follow your initial intent as much as possible. So the genre we're gonna use in this course will be these. So you'll have action, and when you're doing action, the emotion, the main emotion you want to generate is anger or courage, depending on the scene. But most of the time for crisis scene, it will be a combination of anger and courage. If you're doing adventure, in the discovery scenes, because that's the main scenes in terms of adventure, you'll have excitement and wonder. It doesn't have to be a 50-50 split every time. You know, you can add 2/3, 3/4 of one or the other to create a diversity of scene. And you really want only to focus on the synergy between these two main emotions. If you're doing drama, it will be a mix between sadness and exaltation. And if you're doing horror, it will be a combination of fear and angst, or an alternate between fear and angst. Whereas angst will be the short-term emotion, you know, the equivalent to excitement, if you prefer, which will hurt the character in the short term, physically maybe, and fear, which will be the equivalent to wonder, which will linger in the character and hurt them in the long run. Once we've determined our 4 main genres, we'll have to determine our main frames. Now, contrary to the genre, where we've deliberately chose to limit ourselves to 6 genres maximum, frames is a lot more subjective. And as it is far more subjective, we'll still try to limit ourselves to a very limited number of frames. Now, we've chosen to pick 8 of them only, so 2 frames per genre to give you more choices. But it will really depend on your interpretation of any of these words. For example, if you take the term monster, well, a zombie film is a monster film. But as you may see through the correspondence here that we've established, a zombie film will not always exclusively be a horror film, or will sometimes may not be a horror film regarding the contemporary interpretations of the zombie frame. Same thing for war. A war movie, as straining, as painful, as horrible as it is, you know, the event itself, will not always be a horror movie. It can be a drama movie, or it can be a mix of action and horror, or action and drama, or maybe a horror adventure movie. So the same applies for all genres, but let's figure out that these genres have been picked for them to correspond as much as possible to the defined genre, to the corresponding genre. So for example, a Western or a pirate or a criminal-based movie. Not a crime movie, because crime will fall into the mystery thriller category, but a movie in which the main characters are Western type, pirates, criminals. It will often fall in the action genre. Generally, action will be the main genre for these kind of movies. When it comes to science fiction and fantasy, since these stories in most cases tend to be lengthy, tend to be long, tend to be extensive, tend to be open broad. They will generally fall into the adventure genre, since adventure is all about exploration and discovery. Again, any of these genres, especially if you start comparing them to their frames, for example, if you compare adventure and horror to science fiction, fantasy, and monster war, you'll realize really fast that you'll want to combine them. The frames, contrary to the genre, you can think to yourself, okay, I have one main genre for my story, maybe I have a second one, and that's enough for me. But the frames, you will want to combine them because they offer you much more flexibility. So you may want to do a science fiction story with monsters, and combine here adventure and exploration with horror, and you have a typical alien film, a film where the explorer, the company which was designed to, find a certain artifact, will be now decimated. You can go for a fantasy film, and in most fantasy film you'll have factions. In most fantasy stories you'll have organizations, and if you have organization you'll have conflict, and therefore wars. You can try many a combination. Same thing for, you want to start a science fiction type of mystery crime, especially if you're orienting yourself through something you might really enjoy, creating a detective, for example, a detective which evolves in a futuristic setting, and you have a combination between mystery, thriller, and science fiction. And science fiction, as usual, if it's not hard science fiction, if it's not a science fiction based on what we have in terms of engineering today, or what we can do in terms of plausible innovation, science fiction will often include a part of fantasy. Because you want to be flexible with your engineering, with your innovation system, with your invention. So imagine a detective or a group, or even a police force, which is evolving in a science fiction / fantasy setting. Will that make it necessarily a drama adventure? No, not necessarily. There will be a lot of adventure because of the very nature of the investigation. Investigation is adventure in itself. But you may want to have a lot of action. And again, you may want to, if that's your point. And there you have the possibility to include the point of view of multiple characters. On one side, you've got your detectives, you've got your police officers, and on the other side, you have your criminals, And in the very same story, you can include the point of view of the established force, the legitimate administration of the police, and on the other side, the rebels, the criminals. And it will make for a very diverse and extremely synergistic story where the protagonist and the antagonist interact with each other, and you have the point of view of each side. So that would make a brilliant story. Now, let's suppose you want to do action-adventure. And you go for a Western type of frame, or you go for a pirate type of frame. And really, when you think about it, from pirate to Western to what we consider criminal stories today, so stories that are generally based on the mafias, and organized crimes. There's just a progression here, from the spirit which was already the spirit of opposing themselves to the administration because the administration was too rigid. The states were organized in such a way that they would repress the rights of the population. And so these groups formed themselves as a reaction to that, according to their perspective, always according to their perspective. So you may want to start a pirate or western or crime type of story, and you combine it with science fiction, for example. That's not an uncommon. It's not an uncommon setting. You may want to go for fantasy. Again, remember that each time you're doing science fiction, if it's not designed as hard science fiction, you have a lot of flexibility, to turn your inventions, to turn your artifacts into something that's not only running on known energy, on known matter. Now, you may have understood till now that you will want, when you're writing a new story, to combine two genres. You will want to combine two genres to give us more flexibility, the ability to create a more diverse and versatile story. Always by thinking that one of these genres will be dominant, and so subsequently, you'll want to combine multiple frames. You may want to create a hierarchy between, for example, these four concepts here. Maybe you'll consider that Western will be second in priority, pirate will be third, first it will be a science fiction story first, and then the three other elements will be subsequent to that. Every time you're creating a new story, you have the possibility to establish this combination. And as you try new combination, as you try to create new contexts by combining your genre you may have not expected to enjoy, and the corresponding frame, the more you have the ability to experiment, the more you have the ability to develop yourself fast. For example, let's suppose that you consider that either drama or horror is not for you. Well, try a combination of both. If you consider that one of them correspond to you much more, try to combine them both to intensify the training. Now, when it comes to drama and horror, you may consider adding other elements to those which are included here. For example, when it comes to drama, you may think about the theme, the theme of attachment and love between multiple characters. This is not included here. This is not included in pondering, mystery, thriller maybe, or intellect. It is only included in what you consider to be love or attachment. Now, we didn't include anything like love, jealousy, hatred, as it could be, or plot, subversion between two characters, because we consider that it falls into the domain of relationship, and relationships are not specific to any genre or any frame. You can have relationships between character and any type of relationship in any genre, in any frame. And after, you're the author, you're the one who's managing the importance of each kind of relationship and how the relationship will develop. Now, if we go through our standard clockwise system, now you remember, in action, from anger, you go to excitement. From wonder, you go through exaltation. From sadness may emerge angst, and from fear, courage. Well, it's the same. It's always the same clockwise logic in all of our new templates. And every template we're presenting to you will follow this clockwise logic. Again, this is the simplest logic. This is the best logic to start fast and produce a lot, because that's what we intend for you. We want you to start fast, to finish fast, and to produce a lot. But it's certainly not the only logic. For example, here you can completely pass from the intellect part to the criminals part. But no, you'll see just in a moment. So if we start in the Western Pirates part of the quadrant, rebels tend to look for innovation. Rebels tend to innovate. So their life of innovation, of discovery, is an epic. As it is an epic, it is a lengthy life. As it is lengthy, it leaves them a lot of time for pondering. As they're pondering, they develop their intellect. Okay, all of that is the inner part. Now let's go to the outer part. So, as they're pondering a lot, they develop their intellect, and as they become more intelligent, the world around them, the inhabitants of this world, so in another way, people, tend to see them as potentially insidious. Now, if you're too intelligent, you may be seen as insidious. Once you're seen as insidious, you maybe start to be considered evil. And as you start to be considered evil, you may be treated as a criminal. Because now you're too intelligent. You're so intelligent that you can go through your intelligence, you can bypass the rules, you can bypass what's the established order. So you may be seen as a risk. And as you're seen as a risk, you're seen as something detrimental for the group, for society. So you now start to be treated as a criminal. And then we get back to the beginning. You're a criminal. So the basics of the criminal spirit is to have a rebel spirit, a spirit of innovation. You know, and you continue like that. We advise you to go through this process multiple times because it may not look so obvious in the beginning, you know. Having a criminal mind is having an innovative mind because you're a rebel, you know, you're going against the established order. So you'll have a fruitful, plentiful life, you know, at least at the intellectual level, you know, because we're not talking about material resources here. We're talking about intelligence. And as you're too intelligent or you're too different, you know, because now you're thinking a lot, you're different from a lot of part of the population, you may be seen as an devious individual because you're thinking too much. And as you're thinking too much, you may be bypassing the rules again. There's this fear, you know, this fear is created because you have skills that not everybody have, you know, as a rebel. You know, you can start to be seen as someone which will potentially break the established order, and that causes a lot of instability, and the essence of instability is fear. Now, that's it for our context lesson. If you want to create a context, you first pick an emotion. Pick any emotion you want to develop through your story, through your characters, through your settings. Because remember, the atmosphere of an environment is the emotion you're supposed to feel in this environment most of the time. Then you pick the genre corresponding to this emotion. Then you frame this genre in order to establish your context. And when you're satisfied, when you're content with the combination of your genre and your frame, you'll just want to adjust, you know? You pick your genre and your frame in the first, in chapter 1, 2, and 3. And then for chapter 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you will adjust. That's all. You know, in chapter 4, and now you're writing chapter 4. You're starting to adjust. You present new characters, you present new settings. To finish this course, we've presented you some combinations, you know, of genre and some combinations of frames. But if you'd like more combinations, if you'd like more examples, please leave your questions in the comments of the video and we'll answer them. And try to be just as specific as you can, you know, when it comes to
to what you want. For example, I want to write an action adventure. I want to write an action drama. I want to write an action horror, or I want to write an horror adventure. Think about the combination of genre you're most willing to write. And same thing for the frame. For example, you may want to write an action adventure, but you want it to be a mystery. That's interesting. That was not treated here. So leave that question, if that's for your question. If you want to make an action adventure with a mystery frame, leave that in the comment section, and we'll answer it.